Eleanor Vane. She was 24 the night they set a tin plate on the flagstones for her. Brackenhurst Hall. Her first evening there. The stone floor by the kennel passage, where the dogs were fed, still warm from the day. That was the place they gave her. That was where they told her to sit. She did not weep. That is the part I want you to hold on to. She looked at the cold plate on the cold stone, and then she looked up, and she noted which door she could see from there. The door to the servants' hall. She noted who came through it, and when, and in what order. She was already learning the house that meant to feed her with the dogs, and the man who ordered it did not even speak to her. That is the wound. The Earl of Brackenhurst stood in his own hall, before 31 servants drawn up to attention, and he spoke over her head to his butler, as though she were a chair. "She eats with the dogs, Prewitt," he said. "See, she understands it." And Prewitt, careful, courteous, correct in every fold of his coat, bowed and saw that she understood it. The courtesy made it worse. A cruelty done politely is the coldest kind. So every morning and every night she ate where she could watch the door, and she began, very quietly, to read the one book in that house nobody thought a companion worth keeping from. If you've ever been treated as invisible by your own family, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one find you where you are, subscribe so the next one does too. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? I read them. Now, back to Brackenhurst. It was 1826, the autumn of it, when the light comes low across the Shropshire hills and the mornings smell of wood smoke and wet leaf. Eleanor came to Brackenhurst in a hired chaise with one trunk and a hat box, and everything she owned in the world was inside them. Her father had died in the spring, a quiet man, a scholar of small means, a gentleman by blood and not by fortune. When the accounts were settled, there was nothing. No portion, no house, no living. There was only a letter from a cousin she had never met, Marcus, Earl of Brackenhurst, her late father's kinsman, offering her a place as companion to his sister, Lady Augusta. Companion. It is a soft word. In practice, it meant unpaid. It meant she was to fetch and carry and read aloud and hold the wool and say nothing and want nothing and be grateful. She understood the terms before she arrived. She had been raised to letters and to accounts and to courtesy, and courtesy told her to take what was offered and give thanks. So she gave thanks. She thanked the boy who carried her trunk. She thanked the maid who came, late and cold-fingered, to light the grate in her narrow room under the eaves. The grate had not been lit in a long while. The maid was surprised to be thanked at all. Eleanor saw the surprise, and it told her a great deal about the house before she had even unpacked. She learned it quickly, that house. Below stairs is where a great estate keeps its truth, and Eleanor went there without being told to, because that is where the warmth was, and where the people were. In a week she knew every name. She knew that Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, carried the whole order of the place in her head and in a locked book. She knew that Prewitt, the butler, measured his worth by the master's nod. She knew the still-room maid's mother was poorly, and the second footman had a sweetheart in Nether Alden, and the head keeper up at the coverts was a man named Tench, who spoke to nobody he did not respect. She asked for nothing, and she remembered everything. People tell you things when you ask for nothing. She had learned that too. For a few days, she was simply strange to them, a gentlewoman with no money and no rank and no clear place. The upper servants did not know where to put her, so they were merely cool. She ate in a small side room, alone, and that was awkward, but it was a table and a chair, and she thought that was the shape of her life now, and she made her peace with it. Then the Earl came home from London. He came home in a foul temper, for reasons Eleanor did not yet know, but soon would. And on his second evening back, he came through the great hall where the household stood assembled, and his eye fell on her, this poor relation eating up his charity, this reminder of his father's cousin and his own obligation, and something in him decided to fix her, not to correct her, to place her, to settle, once and for all, and in front of everyone, exactly what she was. He did not tell her. That was the whole cruelty of the man. He told the room. "Prewitt!" His voice carried. It was meant to carry. 31 servants stood along the walls, footmen and maids, and the steward, and Mrs. Croft with her keys, all of them still. "My cousin's daughter here seems uncertain of her station. She eats with the dogs. See, she understands it." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly. Eleanor stood in the middle of that silence and felt every eye slide toward her and slide away again, because to look too long would be to share in it. And Prewitt, I want you to see Prewitt, because Prewitt matters later. Prewitt did not smirk. He did not enjoy it. He inclined his head the exact correct number of degrees, and he said, "Very good, my lord," as though he had been asked to have the port decanted. And then he did it. He had a tin plate brought, not china, tin, such as the kennel boy used, and he set it, himself, with his own gloved hands, on the flagstones by the mouth of the kennel passage, where the spaniels were fed at dusk. And he stood back, and he waited, courteous as ever, for her to take her place. You could have heard a pin fall in that hall. Everyone waited to see if she would cry, or run, or beg. She did none of it. She crossed the floor. She lowered herself, in her one good grey gown, and she sat where they had put her, on the cold stone by the dogs. And Prewitt saw, though he told no one for a long while, that she did not look at the plate at all. She turned her head. She looked at the door across the passage, the door to the servants' hall. She watched it, the way a sentry watches a gate. And when the first footman went through it carrying a tray, she marked him. When the still-room maid crossed with the candles, she marked her too. She was not counting her shame. She was counting the traffic of the house. She was learning who moved through it, and when, and who told whom. That was the first offence. And there was one witness who understood what he had done, and his name was Prewitt, and he did not sleep quite so easily that night as he had the night before. Now here is how cruelty spreads. It does not spread by order. It spreads by permission. The Earl never gave a second command. He never needed to. He had shown the house what she was, and the house is a mirror, and the house began to copy him. The upper servants read the placement as leave granted. If the master fed her with the dogs, then she was below the master's people, and the master's people are careful of their own dignity above all things. Within 2 days, the cool distance became something colder. The lady's maid, who had a keen sense of her own consequence, took to sweeping past the kennel passage without a glance, chin up, as though the stone there were empty. The footman learned to serve the side room's small table to no one, because there was no one to serve there now. The still room, the pantry, the hall, one after another, they arranged themselves around the new fact. Twice a day, morning and dusk, before the whole assembled household of 31 souls, the Earl's own kinswoman took her food on a tin plate on the flagstones by the dogs. This is the picture I want you to carry, because it is the cruelest one in the whole of this story, and everything that comes after turns on it. A gentlewoman, straight-backed, in a clean, mended gown, sitting on cold stone, servants stepping around her as if around a puddle, the spaniels nosing at her skirts, friendly, the only creatures in that house who came to her without calculation. And the door across the passage, always the door, and her eyes on it, patient, counting. She never protested, not once. Understand why, because it is the key to her. She had decided in those first days that dignity meant silence, that the only power a powerless woman kept was the power to refuse them her tears. So she gave them nothing. No complaint, no scene, no plea. And they mistook her silence for defeat. They thought a woman who does not fight has surrendered. They did not know they were watching a woman take inventory. Now, what does a companion do all day when no one has any use for her? Lady Augusta had her own maid for her hair, and her own friends for her gossip, and no real employment for Eleanor at all, beyond an occasional summons to read a page or find a shawl, which left Eleanor most hours of most days entirely alone and entirely overlooked. And an overlooked person can go where she likes. She went to the library. Not the fine end of it, where the Earl received visitors among the good bindings, the far end, the unused end, dim and cold, where the shelves held the working books of a great estate, the ones nobody read for pleasure and nobody thought to guard. And there, one grey afternoon, with her fingers cold and her breath faintly showing, Eleanor Vane found the two books that would remake her life. No one thought a woman fed by the kennels was worth keeping from the shelves. That was their whole mistake, laid out in a single sentence. The first was a heavy volume, much handled, its spine cracked from generations of use. The order of precedence. Who ranks above whom? A duke before a marquis before an earl's daughter here, a baronet's wife there, a bishop above a baron at his own table, but below him in the street, the whole invisible ladder of who must be honoured before whom, that governed every dinner and every drawing-room in England, and that most people learned by breathing it from birth. Eleanor had not been born to it, but she had been born to accounts, and this was only another kind of accounting. She began to read it the way she read everything, slowly, completely, committing it. The second book she came to through Tench. She had thanked Tench weeks before for turning the spaniels out of her path one dusk, and Tench, who spoke to nobody he did not respect, had marked that the kennel cousin said thank you to a keeper as though he were a man and not a tool. So, when she asked him quietly, one afternoon at the edge of the coverts, whether there was a book that said who came shooting and when, he looked at her a long moment, and then he showed her the game book, the record of the shooting season, which guests were coming to which day's sport, who was invited to the coverts, and who, pointedly, was not. And beside it, in Tench's own careful hand, the calendar of the season itself, the days marked out from now until the great fixed point that stood over the whole autumn like a church tower over a village. Michaelmas, the 29th of September, a quarter day. The day rents fell due, and servants were hired and dismissed, and the great debts of the year came round to be reckoned. And this Michaelmas, at Brackenhurst, there was to be a dinner. Not an ordinary dinner, the dinner. The political dinner of the Earl's season, the one that all the shooting and all the visiting was building toward. Eleanor read the calendar, and she read the game book, and she began to see the shape of something the Earl himself could not see. She began to memorize the county. Who was invited? Who was quietly, deliberately not? Which neighbours the Earl needed, and which neighbours the Earl had somehow, badly, offended. But before she understood the whole of it, before the pieces came together into the machine they truly were, there was one more offence to bear. And this one did not come from the Earl, and it did not come below stairs. It came at the family table, from the mouth of the woman she was supposed to serve. Lady Augusta had a way of not seeing people. It was a skill in her, cultivated. On this particular evening, Eleanor had been summoned up to the small dining room to fetch a book Lady Augusta wanted read after dinner, and she stood by the sideboard, 2 feet from the table, waiting to be told which book. The Earl was there, a visitor or two, and Lady Augusta, mid-sentence, in the middle of some story about a neighbour, waved her hand toward Eleanor, without looking at her, and said, to the table, "Oh, that is only the kennel cousin, pay her no mind, she fetches things." The kennel cousin, said in the third person, said about her, never to her, while she stood close enough to touch. And that precise construction, was the deepest cut of all. And I want you to understand exactly why. Because Lady Augusta understood it perfectly, and did it on purpose. An insult spoken to your face you can answer, you can meet it. But an insult spoken about you, over your head, as though you are furniture, you cannot answer that without becoming the thing they say you are. If Eleanor had spoken up, if she had said one sharp word, she would have proved the Earl right. She would have been the servant forgetting her place, the poor relation making a scene, the ungrateful creature who did not know the charity she lived on. Silence was the only dignity left to her, and they had built a house in which her silence itself was the proof of her lowness. That is the trap. That is the whole trap of the powerless, and Eleanor stood in it, 2 feet from the table, and said nothing, and fetched the book. But something changed in her that evening. Not on her face. Nothing ever changed on her face. it changed underneath. Up to that night, she had borne it all as a thing to be endured with dignity, silence for silence's sake, a wall to hide behind. Now, walking back down the cold stairs to her narrow room with the book she had been sent for, she understood that endurance was not enough, and it was not even the point. She had been reading the house. She had been reading the county. She had been filling her head with the order of precedence and the game book and the calendar of the season. And she asked herself, on those stairs, a question that no one at that table would ever have thought her capable of asking. Not, how do I survive this? But how does this house actually work, and who really holds it up? And once she asked that question, she could not stop seeing the answer. Because here is what Eleanor understood, sitting by the dogs, watching the door, that the Earl of Brackenhurst, for all his rank, for all his London polish, for all his certainty that the world was arranged by blood, did not understand at all. She understood that in a great house, and above all, in a great county house, in the autumn of 1826, in an old, unreformed county, where a handful of families still decided between them who sat in Parliament and who did not, the seating of a political dinner was not a matter of manners. It was the single most consequential act of administration in the entire estate. Where a man was placed at that table, told him, and told the whole county watching, exactly how much he was valued. It could mend a feud, or seal one. It could carry a marriage, or kill it. It could unlock a vote, or a loan, or a friendship worth a fortune, or slam all three shut, in the length of time it took to walk a guest to his chair. The Earl thought seating was Mrs. Croft's little chore. Eleanor saw it was the lever that moved the whole estate, and she began to trace exactly what the lever was meant to move. Piece by piece, from the game book and the calendar and the talk below stairs, and the letters that lay unguarded in the library, she assembled the Earl's whole situation, and it was more precarious than his proud face let anyone guess. First, the feud. The great neighbouring family of the district were the Marshes, Sir Gideon Marsh and his lady. Old blood, deep pockets, and, crucially, the votes and the credit the Earl needed. And the Earl, in some high-handed moment of the sort that came easily to him, had slighted them. Cut Sir Gideon at the assizes, or overlooked Lady Marsh at some public gathering, or failed some courtesy that a proud family does not forget. Whatever it had been, the coldness now ran deep, and the Marshes were not invited to the coverts, and there was a hole in the Earl's county exactly the shape of the friends he most needed. Second, the money. This was the thing that turned Eleanor's careful curiosity into something with an edge to it. Brackenhurst was mortgaged. £16,000 owed to the Corve Valley Bank, secured against the estate, and coming due in its heavy way as such debts do. £16,000, a crushing weight. The rents alone would never clear it. The house that could not spare its own kinswoman a china plate was itself living one bad season from ruin, and the Earl's cold pride was in part the pride of a man dancing very fast over a very thin floor. Third, and here every thread pulled tight together, the plan to escape it. The Earl had a sister to marry, Lady Augusta, unmarried, ambitious, certain that her rank alone would fetch her the highest seat and the best match. And a good match for Augusta meant a settlement. £12,000 was the figure whispered, from a suitor of fortune. £12,000 that would go a long way toward lifting the 16,000 off the estate's back. But a great marriage is not made in a vacuum. It is made in a county, among families who talk, whose goodwill is the very air a courtship breathes. To marry Augusta well, the Earl needed the county warm to him. He needed the feud with the Marshes mended. He needed to stand once more at the centre of the district's regard, the great man whose friendship was worth having. And all of it, the feud, the marriage, the money, the whole tottering structure of his fortune, all of it was to be settled at one table. The Michaelmas dinner. That was the Earl's throw of the dice. Gather the county, honour the right people, mend the Marshes, show the district that Brackenhurst was still Brackenhurst. And out of that one warm and well-managed evening, pull his sister's marriage and his estate's salvation both. Everything hung on the seating of that dinner, and the Earl thought the seating was a servant's small business, beneath his notice. Eleanor Vane, sitting on the flagstones with a tin plate, watching the door, held in her head by now the order of precedence, the game book, the calendar, the map of the county, the shape of the feud, the figure of the mortgage, and the whole delicate architecture of the Earl's one hope. She held it all, complete, the way she held every set of accounts. And no one in that house knew she held anything at all. They saw a woman fed with the dogs. They did not see that the woman fed with the dogs now understood their house better than any of them, better than the Earl himself, and understood in particular the one thing on which the whole autumn turned. The tone of her, in those weeks, changed from the inside out. The pain did not leave her, but it stopped being the whole of her. Underneath the pain, something patient and clear and almost warm had begun to grow. And it was not hope exactly, and it was not yet a plan. It was competence, waking up. It was a mind that had been told it was worth nothing, quietly discovering that it was worth a very great deal, and biding its time to find out how. And there was one loose thread in all of it that Eleanor had noticed, though she did not yet know what it meant. She had noticed it the way she noticed everything, sideways, patiently, filed away. Mrs. Croft was ailing. Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, the sole keeper of the locked book of precedence, the one soul in the whole of Brackenhurst who had ever, in 30 years of service, actually seated the great table, who carried in her head and her keys and her long practice the entire method of arranging a Brackenhurst dinner, and who had never, in all those years, needed to teach it to another living person, because she had always been there, and it had never once occurred to anyone that she might not be. The house had built its whole grand hospitality on one pair of hands, and had never thought to make a second. Mrs. Croft was the only redundancy the estate possessed, and Mrs. Croft herself had none. And through that late summer, Eleanor had watched the housekeeper grow grey about the mouth. She had seen her pause on the stairs, with a hand pressed to her side. She had heard below the low talk of the maids, that Mrs. Croft was not herself, that she was working through something she ought to be resting from, that she would not hear of taking to her bed with the season coming on and the great dinner to prepare. Mrs. Croft was ailing, and Mrs. Croft would not stop, and the whole household's careful order rested, though none of them said it, on her staying upright until Michaelmas was safely past. Eleanor marked it. She did not yet see the full shape of what it meant, but she was a woman who had learned to watch the door and count who came through it, and some deep, patient, waking part of her understood that a house with only one pair of hands for its most vital work was a house standing on a single thread. And Michaelmas was coming. The calendar in Tench's careful hand ticked toward it, day by day. The coverts were being beaten, the invitations were going out. The great dinner on which the Earl had staked his sister, his fortune, and his standing in the county was drawing nearer through the low autumn light, and the only person in all of Brackenhurst who could actually seat it was growing paler and more silent by the week, working herself thin over a table she might not, in the end, be standing to arrange. Nobody at Brackenhurst was watching that thread, except the woman they fed with the dogs. She watched everything. She had learned to, and she sat by the kennel passage in the falling dark, with the spaniels warm against her skirts and the tin plate cold at her side, her eyes on the door across the way, and she waited, for what she could not yet have told you, while the one thread the whole house hung by drew tighter and thinner, and the days ran down toward Michaelmas. It came a week before Michaelmas, on a grey Tuesday morning, in the passage outside the still room. Eleanor heard it before she saw it. A sound like a sack going down, then a cup breaking on stone, then nothing at all, which was worse. She was at the kennel passage with her tin plate on her knee. She set it aside. She did not run. She had learned, in her weeks at Brackenhurst, that a woman who runs is a woman who is noticed, and she was not ready yet to be noticed. She walked, quick, but a walk. Mrs. Croft lay half against the wall, with her keys spilled beside her. Her face was the colour of tallow. Her hand was still pressed to her side, even in the faint, as though the pain had gone with her down into the dark, and she could not put it off. A scullery maid was screaming. A footman stood with his mouth open. Nobody moved. "Fetch Mr. Prewitt," Eleanor said. Quiet, even. "You, now! And you, warm water and a blanket. Don't stand there." They went. It is a strange thing about a house in a crisis. It will take an order from anyone who sounds as though she has the right to give one, and never stop to ask where she got the right. Mrs. Croft was carried up. The doctor was sent for from Nether Alden. He came, and he stayed the better part of an hour, and when he came down, his face told the story before his mouth did. "She is not to leave that bed," he said to Prewitt in the hall. "Not for a fortnight. Not to sit up and write. Not to walk the corridors. Not to lift so much as a spoon. Her heart is strained near to stopping. You will kill her if you let her work." "But the dinner," Prewitt said, and then he stopped, because a butler does not argue household business before a stranger. "Thank you, doctor. I understand you." He did not understand. Eleanor watched his face and saw that he did not. She saw the exact moment the thing arrived in him, the calendar, and the collapse, and the gap where the only competent hand in the house had been. She saw him go pale in a different way than Mrs. Croft had, a slower way. Because the Michaelmas dinner was in 6 days, and the woman who had seated every Brackenhurst table for 20 years lay upstairs forbidden to lift a spoon, and there was no one else. Prewitt knew there was no one else. That was the terror in his face. The steward could count the silver, the cook could dress a haunch of venison, but not one of them had ever laid out an order of precedence for a table of 40 county grandees, half of whom hated the other half, all of whom would read insult into a chair set 6 inches too low. Get it wrong, and Sir Gideon Marsh would rise and leave before the fish. And the feud the Earl had staked his sister and his fortune on mending would harden into stone. Prewitt stood in the hall a long time. Then he did a thing that must have cost him more than anything he had done in 40 years of service. He came and found the companion by the kennels. Eleanor was at her place, tin plate, cold flagstones, the spaniels warm at her skirts. She had gone back to it. She had wanted him to find her exactly there. "Miss Vane," he said. It was the first time he had called her Miss anything. For 6 weeks she had been you or nothing, or a plate set down without a word. "Mr. Prewitt." He looked at the tin plate. She watched him look at it. To his credit, and she gave him the credit silently, he did not pretend it wasn't there. "You have been reading," he said. "In the library, the far end." "I have." "The Order of Precedence, Lord Brackenhurst's own volume." "Yes." He swallowed. "Mrs. Croft is very ill. There is no one who knows the table. The dinner is Monday." He stopped. He could not make himself say the rest. So she said it for him, gently. She had no wish to make him crawl. "You want to know if I can seat it?" "Yes," Prewitt said. "God help me, yes." And there it was. The whole house, with its 31 servants, and its earl and its lady, and its mortgage, and its feud, had come down the passage in the person of one frightened butler to ask the woman it fed with the dogs to save it. She could have made him wait. She could have made him say please. She could have named the plate and the flagstones and the 31 who had stood to attention while the Earl told him over her head that this was her place. She did none of it. She had decided, weeks ago, and without quite knowing it, what she would do when this hour came. Not vengeance, something colder and cleaner than vengeance. "Bring me Mrs. Croft's book," she said, "and the cards, and a pen. I'll want the library, the far table, and no one to disturb me. And Mr. Prewitt, the guest list, the final one, everyone who has accepted." "Yes, Miss Vane." He went to fetch it, and Eleanor Vane set down the tin plate, and stood, and brushed the kennel straw from her skirts, and walked into the house, not as its ghost, but as the one pair of hands that could keep it standing. She did not protest the plate. She took up the pen. The library that evening was very quiet. One candle, then a second when the first burned low. The order of precedence open at her left hand. Mrs. Croft's locked book, unlocked now by Mrs. Croft's own keys, open at her right. The blank cards in a stack, the pen. She had it all in her head already. The weeks of being invisible had been weeks of study. She knew the county now, the way Tench knew his coverts. She knew who was invited and who was quietly not. She knew from the game book which neighbours the Earl had walked with and which he had let go cold. She knew the shape of the feud, though not yet its cause. She knew the £16,000 owed to the Corve Valley Bank, secured on the very stones around her. She knew Lady Augusta was to be married for 12,000, and that the 12,000 was meant to lift the 16, and that none of it moved an inch unless the county was mended first. And the county would be mended, or not, by where 40 people sat to eat their soup. She understood a thing the Earl did not. He thought rank governed his house. He thought the seating was a formality, a matter of getting the dukes above the baronets and being done with it. He could not see that hospitality was administration, that the table was the one machine in the county that could turn an enemy into an ally in the space of a single evening, if a clever hand ran it, and could break a house in the same span if a careless one did. She was the clever hand. No one had meant her to be. They had fed her by the dogs and left the library unlocked because no one thought a woman fed by the kennels worth keeping from the shelves. She dipped the pen. By rank, Lady Augusta sat highest of the ladies, the Earl's own sister. It was automatic. It was what Mrs. Croft would have done, what any correct house would do, what Lady Augusta herself expected as she expected the sun to rise. Eleanor did not seat by rank. She seated by consequence. She put Lady Marsh, the wife of Sir Gideon Marsh, the man whose votes and whose credit the Earl needed more than he needed air, she put Lady Marsh at the Earl's right hand, above Lady Augusta, above the sister, in the one seat in all of England that said, without a word, before all the county, "You are the most honoured woman at this table, and this house esteems you." It was a scandal in a chair. It was also the only move on the board that could win, because Sir Gideon Marsh was coming to the dinner expecting a cold shoulder. He was coming braced for slight, ready to be offended, half hoping to be, so that he might rise and leave and have his grievance confirmed. And instead of the cold shoulder, he would find his wife lifted above the Earl's own blood. A public apology that cost the Earl nothing but his pride and bought him everything he needed. No words could have said it. A chair said it in silence and could not be argued with. She threaded the rest of the table around that single, audacious placement. The neighbours the Earl had offended, she set among the neighbours who still liked him, so that goodwill might carry across the gaps. The talkers she scattered so no dead silence could form. The two men who hated each other over a boundary hedge she put at opposite ends, out of eyeshot. She built, card by card, not a display of rank, but a working alliance, a hostile table threaded into friendship by where each body sat. She worked until the second candle guttered. Then she squared the cards and laid them in order, and set Mrs. Croft's book gently closed on top of them. She did not sign anything. There was nothing to sign. The whole of her authority was invisible, which was the point. The cards would be set out by the footman. The guests would find their names, and no one, not the Earl, not Lady Augusta, not the county, would know that the table had been seated by the woman they fed with the dogs. That was the beauty of it. She had learned, at the kennel passage, exactly how much power there is in being unseen. Prewitt came at dawn. He looked at the laid-out cards a long time. He was a man who had seated tables under Mrs. Croft for 20 years, and he knew good work when he saw it, and he knew this was better than good. His eye stopped at the Earl's right hand, at the card that read Lady Marsh. He went very still. "Miss Vane," he said carefully. "Her ladyship, Lady Augusta, she sits by rank." "She sits where I have placed her," Eleanor said. "Mr. Prewitt, you asked me to seat the table so that Monday does not end the Earl's hopes. This is how it does not end them. If you would rather seat it by rank and watch Sir Gideon walk out before the fish, the pen is there. He looked at the card again. He was not a stupid man, cruel once, on an order, but not stupid. He saw slowly what she had done. He saw the whole machine of it, and he saw that she was right, and that it would work, and that it would horrify Lady Augusta, and that saying so to the Earl would put his own head on the block for having handed the table to a companion. So he did the second thing that cost him. He said nothing. He let it stand, to spare himself, and told himself it was to spare the house. And in the telling, he half noticed the hand that had drawn it, and looked away from what he half noticed, the way a man looks away from a thing he does not want to be responsible for having seen. That was the first cycle. She drafted, he half saw, he chose not to see. The second came at noon. Lady Augusta swept through the hall on her way to try a gown, and her eye fell on the cards laid ready on the side table for the footman. She stopped. She looked. She was searching for one name and one name only, and she found it, Lady Augusta Brackenhurst, and saw that it sat near the head of the table, high and honoured, and did not trouble to read whose name sat higher still. "Good," she said to no one. "At least someone knows their business." And she swept on, reassured, to her gown. She had glanced at the very card that would humiliate her before the county, and read in it only her own importance, and gone away pleased. Eleanor watched her go from the shadow of the corridor. She felt no triumph. That surprised her a little. She felt only the deep, level calm of a woman who has set a thing in motion that cannot now be stopped, and who knows it, and who waits. Monday came bright and cold. The carriages began at 4. Eleanor watched them from an upper window, unseen as always. She could name every crest on every door. She had studied them for weeks. Here came the Ludlows, whom the Earl still had. Here came old Sir Peter Vane, no relation to her, though the name gave her a private, bitter smile, whom he had let go cold. And here, last and grandest and most dangerous, the Marsh carriage, black and severe, with Sir Gideon's hard face at the glass, and Lady Marsh beside him, small and straight and braced for insult. They went in. The county went in. 40 people, half of them enemies, into a dining room hung with candlelight and the whole hope of the house. Eleanor did not go in. Of course she did not. She stood in the passage by the door to the servants' hall, the door she had watched for 6 weeks from the flagstones, and she listened. She heard them seated. She heard the scrape and settle of 40 chairs. She heard the small pause that comes when people read the cards and understand where they have been placed. And then she heard Sir Gideon Marsh's voice, which she had never heard before, carry through the door, surprised and low and warm in a way no one had expected it to be that night. "My wife," he said, "at his lordship's right hand." A pause. "Well?" said Sir Gideon Marsh. "Well now?" That was the sound of a feud beginning to end. Eleanor heard it happen. She stood in the dark passage and heard, through a door, the exact instant an enemy became an ally, because a chair had told him a thing the Earl was too proud to say aloud, and the chair could not be doubted and did not ask anything in return. The soup went in. The talk warmed. Down the length of that dangerous table the temperature rose, degree by degree, as the placement did its silent work. Sir Gideon leaned toward the Earl. The Earl, who had come to the evening braced for a rout, felt his ruin turning into rescue in real time, and did not know how, and did not dare ask, and only kept the good fortune going with both hands. He thought his steward had done it. He thought Prewitt had done it as always, by Mrs. Croft's long-laid plan. He did not once think of the woman in the passage. Why would he? She ate with the dogs. It held through the fish. It held through the venison. The Earl was rebuilding his reputation with every course, and the county was watching him do it. And not one soul in that bright room knew whose hand had built the room they sat in. And then, over the sweets, it broke. It broke because Lady Augusta, glowing all evening in what she took for her own triumph, finally let her eye travel one seat higher than her own. To the Earl's right, to Lady Marsh, small and honoured in the place that was hers by blood. Eleanor could not see it, but she could imagine it perfectly, and she was right in every part. The slow understanding, the disbelief, the colour rising, the whispered, furious question to the footman who did not know, and then worse to Prewitt, stationed grave and silent at the sideboard, who did. Who seated this table? And Prewitt, cornered, at last, between his mistress and the truth, could not lie to the Earl's own sister in the Earl's own house. He said it, low, once. "Miss Vane, my lady." Eleanor, in the passage, heard nothing of the words. She heard only the sound that followed them, a chair pushed back too hard, a woman's voice, high and cracked, cutting across the warm murmur of 40 guests like a wire. "You seated me," Lady Augusta said, "below that woman. You let the kennel cousin put a marsh above me at my own brother's table." Silence fell down the whole length of the room like a dropped cloth. Eleanor came to the door then. She did not go in. She stood at the threshold, in the servant's shadow, and she looked down the bright table, and she saw the Earl's face. He understood in one breath. She watched it arrive in him, exactly as it had arrived in Prewitt 6 days before. The plate, the flagstones. The order given over her head to fix her rank forever. And now, tonight, his whole county, his sister's marriage, his 12,000, his 16,000 owed to the Corvey Valley Bank, his standing, his future, all of it, seated, saved, and sitting in front of him by the hand of the woman he had fed with the dogs. He looked down the table. At Sir Gideon Marsh, leaning in, thawed, an ally where an enemy had sat an hour before. At the county, warm and won. At the whole evening, rescued. And he understood the trap of it, which was the cleanest part of all. He could overturn it. He could rise and apologize to his sister and have Lady Marsh move down and salvage Augusta's pride. And in the same motion he would insult the Marshes past all mending and undo the alliance in front of every witness in the county and lose the votes and the credit and the match and the 12,000 and the house. Or he could let it stand. He could let the judgment of the kennel cousin govern his table before all the county and keep everything she had built. He looked at his sister, white and shaking. He looked at Sir Gideon Marsh, warm and waiting. He looked, last, at the door, and found Eleanor Vane standing in it, quiet, in her plain grey gown, watching him as she had watched everything. The whole room waited, and the Earl of Brackenhurst did the one thing that closed the account. He did nothing. He let it stand. He rose, not to overturn the table, to save it. He took up his glass, and he made his voice carry, and he said the words that could never afterward be unsaid. "My friends," he said, "you sit tonight at the best-seated table this house has laid in 20 years, and I will not take the credit for another's skill." He paused. His jaw worked once. "The table was arranged by my cousin, Miss Eleanor Vane. I ask you to drink to her." And the county rose. 40 people, half of them grandees, rose in that candlelit room and lifted their glasses to the woman who had, 3 nights running, eaten from a tin plate on the flagstones by the dogs. "Miss Vane," they said. The table that had fed her with the kennels drank her health and could not take it back. Lady Augusta rose too. She had to. To stay seated through her brother's toast would have been a scandal greater than the seating. She lifted her glass with a hand that shook, and her smile was a wound, and over the rim of it she found one dry thing to say, low, to the Earl as they sat. "I did not know," she said, "that the arrangement was hers." The Earl did not answer her. That was Eleanor's answer, given through him. Silence. The same silence Augusta had used weeks ago at the family table when she had spoken of the kennel cousin in the third person 2 feet from Eleanor's face, the insult said about her, never to her, so that she could never answer it. The silence came back now to its author. Lady Augusta drank below her rival, and no one said a word to comfort her, and the not saying was the whole of the reply. Prewitt stood in the doorway. He caught Eleanor's eye across the bright room, and the man who had set the tin plate on the flagstones by the kennel passage, the man who had obeyed the order courteously, correctly, and made it worse by his care, inclined his head to her. A small bow. The exact bow a butler gives to a lady of the house whose card he waits upon. The upper servants who had copied the placement, who had fed her twice a day before all 31 of the hall, they carried her health in their own dishes now, up and down the very table she had seated. Every one of them. She watched them do it and said nothing. The guests began to leave near midnight. At the great door, Sir Gideon Marsh took his leave of the Earl and paused, drawing on his glove, and asked the question Eleanor had known he would ask. Brackenhurst, that's seating tonight. Cleverest bit of hospitality I've sat down to in years, and God knows this county needed it. Who's to be thanked? Your Mrs. Croft. No, the Earl said. It cost him, still, but he said it. Mrs. Croft is ill. My cousin seated the table, Miss Vane. Then present my compliments to Miss Vane, said Sir Gideon Marsh, and tell her Marsh does not forget a courtesy. And he went out to his black carriage, thawed, and the votes and the credit went out with him, warm. When the last wheel had crunched away down the drive, and the house was emptying of candlelight, the Earl found Eleanor in the hall. They were alone, or near it. Prewitt at a distance, pretending to see to the plate. The Earl did not know what to say to her. He was not a man who had ever apologized in his life. He did not apologize now. He stood before the cousin he had exiled to the dogs, saved by her, in her debt past any counting, and he could find no words at all. So, Eleanor gave him hers, calm, level, not cruel. She had no need to be cruel, and cruelty would have cheapened it. Just true. She eats with the dogs, you told the hall, my lord. She let it sit a moment in the quiet. And so I did. I ate where I could watch the door. She looked at him steadily. A companion who watches the door learns who is allowed through it. That is all I have done tonight. I watched, and I learned, and I seated your county by what I saw. You gave me the seat by the kennels, my lord. You never thought a woman could see the whole house from there. She inclined her head, the smallest, most exact courtesy, and left him standing in his rescued hall with nothing to say. The rest followed as such things follow once the first stone is moved. The Marsh alliance held. Sir Gideon's credit steadied the Earl at the Core Valley Bank, where a man's neighbours count for as much as his acres. Lady Augusta's match, the £12,000 meant to lift the 16, went forward on the county goodwill of that single evening, for a good match is made of a family standing, and the family standing had been made, in the space of one dinner, by Eleanor's hand. The house that had exiled her now ran, in every part that mattered, on her competence. Reward and reckoning in the same frame. The Earl kept everything, and could keep none of it without her. Mrs. Croft mended, slowly, propped on her pillows. When she was well enough to see the plans, Eleanor brought them up to her, unasked, and sat by the bed while the old housekeeper read them through. Mrs. Croft turned the cards over one by one with a thin hand. "You put Lady Marsh above her ladyship," she said at last. "I did. 20 years I seated this table by rank." Mrs. Croft laid the cards down. "And I would have seated it by rank on Monday, and Sir Gideon would have walked out before the fish, and the Earl would have been ruined, and I would have called it correct." She looked at Eleanor a long moment. "Keep the plans, Miss Vane, all of them. Keep them for good. They were seated better than I ever managed, and I am too old to learn the difference, and too honest to pretend I don't see it." So the plans passed into Eleanor's keeping, and stayed there. A year on, it is a bright, cold Michaelmas morning again, and the coverts below the terrace are loud with the shooting party assembling. Eleanor Vane takes her breakfast on the terrace, in the thin gold sun, and she takes it from a tin plate. The same tin plate. She kept it. She had it washed, and she keeps it, and she eats from it by choice now, not by sentence. A plain tin plate among the good porcelain, on a fine terrace, in the sun, hers. It is a private joke she shares with no one, and it is also the truest thing she owns. The house fed her from it to make her small. She eats from it now to remember that they could not. Two houses stand in her mind as she watches the guns go down toward the birds. There is the house run on rank, the house that fed a gentlewoman by the kennels because her purse was empty and her name was poor, and that very nearly lost the whole county on the strength of a chair set by pride. And there is the house run on competence, the house in which every card at every dinner now passes first through her hand before a single name is written, because they have learned, at ruinous cost, what her judgment is worth. The Earl never did apologize. He never will. It is not in him. But he sends her the guest list now before he answers an invitation, and waits on her word before he accepts or declines, and calls that respect. And in his way, it is. Lady Augusta is married and gone to a house of her own 2 counties off. She writes sometimes. The letters are stiff and never quite warm, and always, in the end, come round to the same question. How, she writes, ought the tables to be arranged, for she finds she has no notion of it, and her own housekeeper is not equal to a difficult evening. Would her cousin advise? Her cousin advises.
Eleanor answers every letter, plainly and well, and never once reminds her of the kennel passage, because the not reminding is a finer answer than any reminding could be. The guns crack, far below, in the bright cold air. The spaniels go out across the frost. Eleanor Vane sits on her terrace with the county's whole social machine running through her hands, and finishes her breakfast from a tin plate, and is, at last, in a place she cannot be moved from. The person you exile from the table, it turns out, is the only one who ever troubles to learn how the table works. Remember that, wherever you are seated. And if a house has ever fed you by its kennels and thought you would not notice the door, comment your city below and tell me you watched it too.